It was a typical Thursday evening, the kind of night where the mundane wrapped around me like a comforting old sweater. The rhythmic hum of the dishwasher filled the kitchen, blending with the distant sounds of the TV where my wife, Sophie, and I had settled into our routine. She was curled up on the couch with her laptop, working on something she hadn't explained, and I was finishing up a small mountain of paperwork at the dining table. "Do you want tea?" I called out, breaking the soft monotony of the evening. "No, I'm fine," she replied without looking up, her voice flat, distracted. A simple enough response, but something in the tone made me glance at her. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, her eyes darting back and forth across the screen. She was always a quick typist, but tonight, there was a frantic energy to it. She seemed tense. Shrugging off the feeling, I returned to my work. A few moments later, Sophie's phone buzzed loudly against the wooden coffee table. She didn't reach for it immediately, which struck me as odd. Sophie was glued to her phone most evenings, scrolling social media, chatting with friends, or sending me memes from the other side of the couch. But this time, her head snapped toward it like she'd forgotten where she was. "Who's texting you this late?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, almost teasing. "Oh, just a work thing," she said quickly, a little too quickly, as she snatched up the phone and flipped it over, screen down. "Nothing important." Her explanation didn't land right. Sophie was a designer for a small boutique and rarely received after-hours messages from work. Her boss was the kind of person who valued boundaries. Texts about fabrics or clients could wait until morning. I let it go, but my mind began spinning like a wheel on ice. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Everyone's allowed a private moment, even in marriage. But there was something about how she moved after that, the way her fingers nervously brushed her hair behind her ear, how she seemed to fidget more than usual, that planted a tiny seed of doubt in my chest. An hour later, Sophie yawned, stretching her arms dramatically. "I'm going to head to bed early," she said, her voice light, a little too cheerful. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was barely 9:15, and Sophie was anything but a morning person. She usually clung to her late-night rituals, true crime documentaries, and the occasional glass of wine. "Feeling okay?" I asked. "Yeah, just tired," she said with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "Good night." I watched her disappear down the hallway, leaving me alone with the faint echoes of her footsteps and my swirling thoughts. I didn't follow her right away. Something about the whole night felt off. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the text, or her sudden need for solitude, or maybe it was the way she'd avoided eye contact since dinner. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself that everyone has an off day. But when I finally joined her in bed, the strangeness grew. She was turned away from me, her breathing slow and even as if she were asleep, but I could see her phone light up faintly on the nightstand. The glow faded quickly, but the image was already burned into my mind. Another message. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and Sophie's soft humming in the kitchen. She was acting perfectly normal again, as if the odd tension of the night before had never happened. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, and she was frying eggs, swaying slightly to the music playing from her phone. The sight should have been comforting, but instead, it left me feeling disoriented. "Morning," I said, sliding onto a stool at the kitchen island. "Morning," she replied brightly, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of me. "You've got that meeting at 10, right?" I nodded, studying her as she bustled around the kitchen, gathering her own breakfast. She was calm, cheerful even, as if nothing unusual had occurred. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go, chalking up my unease to my own overthinking. But the moment passed. "Hey," I started carefully, "what was that text about last night?" Her hand paused mid-reach for the butter. Just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. She said, playing innocent as she resumed spreading butter on her toast. "The one that came through right before you went to bed," I pressed. "It just seemed, I don't know, urgent." "Oh, that," she said, laughing lightly. "It was just Denise, something about a client needing a last-minute change. I told her I'd handle it today. No big deal." She sounded convincing, but something about her answer didn't sit right. Denise wasn't the type to message Sophie late at night. She respected Sophie's time outside of work. I knew because Sophie complained about her clients all the time, and Denise had always been the buffer. But I let it drop again, unwilling to turn breakfast into a scene. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed to trust her. And yet, as the day went on, my mind kept returning to that moment when her hand had faltered. A small crack in the glass of our routine, but a crack nonetheless. That evening, Sophie left for her usual yoga class. I stayed home, half-heartedly watching TV while a restless energy bubbled under my skin. I couldn't stop replaying the night before, or the text, or the brief pause at breakfast. It all felt too perfectly glossed over, like an actor covering up a forgotten line. I found myself wandering into the bedroom, drawn to her side of the bed. Her phone was gone, but her laptop was still on the nightstand. It was locked with a password I didn't know, something I'd never questioned before. We respected each other's privacy. But now, that locked screen felt like a barrier, a symbol of the distance I was beginning to feel. The sound of the garage door startled me, and I quickly returned to the living room, trying to appear nonchalant. Sophie walked in moments later, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder and her cheeks flushed. "How was class?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Good," she said, her voice breathless. "We did a lot of stretching tonight. I feel amazing." She leaned in to kiss me, and I caught a faint scent of perfume. It wasn't hers. "Did you stop somewhere after class?" I asked casually. She blinked, her smile faltering. "Oh, yeah. I grabbed a smoothie." "Why?" "No reason," I said, masking my unease. She headed upstairs to shower, and I sat there, staring at the blank TV screen. The perfume wasn't fruity or sweet, like something from a smoothie shop. It was musky and rich, something I'd never smelled on her before. Later that night, Sophie fell asleep quickly, or at least pretended to. I lay awake beside her, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. The crack in the glass had widened, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. Something that felt like the beginning of a story I didn't want to read. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of an inexplicable shift in our world. It was just small things, I told myself. A text, a pause, perfume, nothing concrete. But sometimes, I thought, the smallest cracks are all it takes for the glass to shatter. The weekend came and went, passing like a blur of normalcy. Sophie and I went grocery shopping together, took a walk around the neighborhood, and even binge-watched a show we'd been meaning to catch up on. By all accounts, things seemed fine, maybe even better than usual. Yet, a nagging unease clung to me, like a shadow in the corner of my vision that refused to disappear. On Monday morning, as Sophie left for work, she lingered a second longer at the door. She kissed me with an enthusiasm that felt deliberate. "Have a good day," she said, flashing her brightest smile before stepping out. I stood at the window, watching her car pull away, her taillights fading into the morning haze. A strange thought settled in my mind. Was that kiss meant to reassure me, or herself? The first clue appeared almost by accident. After Sophie left, I wandered into the kitchen to make my coffee. Her travel mug was sitting on the counter. It wasn't unusual. Sophie was notorious for forgetting things in the morning rush. But as I reached for it to rinse it out, I noticed a faint lipstick stain on the rim. A deep crimson shade, sophisticated and bold. Not Sophie's style. She rarely wore makeup at all, let alone something as striking as red lipstick. I set the mug down, staring at it as if it might reveal a secret. Maybe she'd been experimenting with a new look? Or maybe the mug wasn't hers. It wasn't implausible. She could have lent it to someone at work. But why did it feel like my brain was working overtime to explain away something so trivial? Later that day, I tackled a pile of laundry Sophie had left in the hamper. As I folded her clothes, I found myself moving with a mechanical efficiency, folding shirts and pairing socks while my thoughts wandered back to the lipstick. It was probably nothing, I kept telling myself. But then I reached for her gym clothes, the same ones she'd worn to yoga last Thursday, and froze. There was an unfamiliar smell on them. It wasn't sweat or detergent, or anything I could immediately place. It was sharp, almost spicy, like cologne. I brought the fabric closer to my face and sniffed again, my stomach nodding as the scent became more distinct. Maybe someone at the studio wears cologne, I muttered under my breath, trying to rationalize it. But doubt was already creeping in. Yoga studios usually smelled of eucalyptus and lavender, not someone's aftershave. The clues kept adding up in ways that were easy to dismiss if I squinted hard enough. Sophie had been staying late at work more often, claiming she was swamped with deadlines. She seemed more protective of her phone, too, never leaving it unattended for more than a few moments. And then there were the errands. Sophie had always been efficient, but lately, a quick run to the store could stretch into an hour or more. Traffic, she said one evening when I asked why it had taken so long to grab bread and eggs. The checkout lines were insane. It was a reasonable explanation, and yet, something in her tone felt rehearsed, manufactured. I hated how suspicious I was becoming. It wasn't like me. But every time I tried to shrug it off, my brain latched onto another inconsistency. The tipping point came one night when Sophie went to bed early again, citing a headache. I stayed up, restless and unable to shake the tension that had been building in me all week. I ended up in the living room, mindlessly scrolling through the TV guide when something caught my eye. Sophie's purse, sitting half-zipped on the coffee table. I hesitated. We'd always respected each other's privacy. Snooping was beneath me. But the purse seemed to hum with an unspoken invitation, daring me to look closer. My fingers itched as I stared at it, my chest tightening with the weight of my internal conflict. Finally, I gave in. I approached it slowly, like a thief in the night, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Carefully, I slid the zipper open and peeked inside. At first, everything looked normal. Her wallet, keys, and a small pouch of makeup. But as I sifted through the contents, something caught my attention. A crumpled receipt tucked into a side pocket. I smoothed it out and scanned the details. It was from a boutique hotel in the next town over, dated 2 days prior. The charges included a room and a bottle of champagne. My stomach churned. Sophie had told me she'd been at work late that evening. She'd even come home complaining about the stress of her workload. So why was there a receipt for a hotel room and champagne? For a moment, I stood frozen, the receipt trembling in my hands. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stop jumping to conclusions. Maybe she'd booked the room for someone else. Maybe it was a mistake, a glitch, a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I watched her closely, looking for cracks in her facade. She moved through the morning with her usual cheerfulness, humming as she buttered her toast. When she kissed me goodbye, I caught that same faint whiff of perfume that didn't belong to her. As soon as she left, I decided to follow the trail. I called the boutique hotel, pretending to inquire about a reservation mix-up. My hands were shaking as I held the phone to my ear. "Hi, this is Ian Brooks," I said, using a fake name. "I think my wife might have accidentally charged her room to the wrong card last Thursday. Could you confirm her reservation under the name Sophie Blake?" The woman on the other end hesitated for a moment. "Let me check. Yes, I see a reservation for that date. It was for one night. And, was there another guest listed?" My voice cracked slightly, and I cleared my throat. "Let me see. Yes, there's a second name, Colin Ward." I felt the air leave my lungs as if someone had punched me. Colin. The name wasn't familiar, but that almost made it worse. Whoever he wasn't a client or a coworker Sophie had ever mentioned. "Thank you," I muttered, hanging up before I could say something foolish. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. The lipstick, the cologne, the late nights, and now this. It was no longer paranoia or a series of coincidences. The pieces fit together too perfectly. When Sophie came home that evening, I tried to act normal, but it took every ounce of effort not to confront her then and there. She chattered about her day, smiling as if nothing had changed. As she went on about her meeting with Denise, my eyes lingered on her left hand, where her wedding ring caught the light. It felt like a cruel joke, a silent reminder of the vows we'd taken and the lies she was weaving now. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I was no longer just suspicious, I was certain. And certainty, I realized, was far more painful. The morning after I'd confirmed Sophie's reservation with Colin Ward, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. I'd slept little, and the sleep I did get was restless, filled with disjointed dreams of Sophie slipping away from me, laughing in the arms of a faceless man. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts colliding like waves in a storm. The receipt, the hotel confirmation, the lipstick, all of it painted a damning picture. Yet, a stubborn part of me clung to the possibility of an explanation, however unlikely. What if I was wrong? What if this was all some elaborate misunderstanding, and confronting her would ruin what we had over nothing? It was a strange sensation to both want the truth and dread it with every fiber of my being. I was trapped between the fear of losing Sophie and the fear of looking like a fool for not trusting her. I needed clarity, but I wasn't sure if I could handle what it might reveal. That afternoon, I met my friend Jack for coffee. Jack had been my best friend since college, a blunt but fiercely loyal confidant who'd always had a knack for cutting through my overthinking. "You look like hell," Jack said as I slid into the booth across from him. "What's going on?" I hesitated. Sharing my suspicions felt like crossing a line. Airing the dirty laundry of a marriage I still wasn't ready to admit might be unraveling. But Jack had a way of pulling the truth out of me. "It's Sophie," I admitted, stirring my coffee absently. I think she's hiding something." Jack leaned back, his brow furrowing. "Hiding what? Be specific." I told him everything: the text, the perfume, the hotel receipt, the name Colin Ward. Jack listened quietly, his face unreadable as he sipped his coffee. When I finished, he set his cup down and gave me a hard look. "You sure you're not reading too much into this?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, rubbing my temples. "I want to believe it's nothing, but the signs, they keep piling up. I don't want to accuse her without proof, but I can't just ignore it anymore." Jack nodded slowly. "Look, I get it. You're trying to protect what you have. But if you keep this bottled up, it's going to eat you alive. You need to confront her, or find out for sure what's going on." His words landed like a stone in my chest. Confrontation felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing what lay below. But digging further felt just as dangerous, like prying open a wound that might never heal. That evening, Sophie came home later than usual. I was on the couch, pretending to read, though I hadn't turned a page in over an hour. She walked in with a casual smile, setting her purse on the counter. "Long day?" I asked, my voice too neutral, even to my own ears. "Yeah," she said, her tone light. "Traffic was awful, and Denise kept me late with some last-minute changes." I forced a smile, though her answer only fueled my doubts. Was Denise real this time, or just another convenient excuse? The temptation to confront her boiled under the surface, but I bit my tongue. Not yet. As she went about her evening routine, I studied her closely. The way she hummed softly while making tea, the ease of her movements. She seemed relaxed, completely unbothered, as if nothing were amiss. Either she was innocent, or she was an exceptional actress. The turning point came the following day. Sophie left for another, late meeting, kissing me goodbye before stepping out. Once she was gone, I paced the living room, my thoughts churning. Jack's advice echoed in my head, but I couldn't shake the fear of confrontation. Instead, I resolved to gather more information. I decided to check the Find My app, a feature we'd both agreed to use when one of us forgot their phone. My hand shook as I opened the app and waited for Sophie's location to appear. My heart dropped when I saw the dot hovering miles away from her office. It was a small bar on the edge of town, one I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to grab my keys and drive there, but I hesitated. What if I found her there with someone else? What would I even say? After wrestling with my nerves for what felt like an eternity, I made up my mind. I had to know. The bar was dimly lit and sparsely populated, with a jukebox playing softly in the corner. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, scanning the room for Sophie. I spotted her almost immediately, sitting at a booth in the back. She wasn't alone. A man sat across from her, leaning in close as they spoke. I couldn't make out their conversation, but their body language told me more than I needed to know. Sophie was smiling, her head tilted slightly, her hands resting casually on the table. The man reached out, brushing her fingers lightly. She didn't pull away. I felt a mix of rage and devastation bubbling up inside me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer to the booth. But just as I was about to confront her, Sophie turned her head, and our eyes met. Her smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked as shocked as I felt. Then, quickly, she stood and came toward me, leaving the man at the booth. "Mark," she said, her voice low but urgent. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "It's not what it looks like," she said quickly, glancing back at the man, who was now watching us with a wary expression. "Let's talk outside." I hesitated, glancing between her and the man. Finally, I nodded, following her out into the cool night air. Outside, Sophie turned to me, her face a mixture of guilt and resolve. "Mark, I know this looks bad," she said, "but I can explain." "Then explain," I said, crossing my arms. "That's Colin," she said, motioning toward the bar. "He's someone I used to know, from before we were together. He reached out recently, and I agreed to meet him." "Why?" My voice cracked with the weight of the question. "I don't know," she said, running a hand through her hair. "Curiosity, maybe. I swear, it's nothing serious. We were just catching up." "Catching up?" I said bitterly. "At a hotel? With champagne? Don't lie to me, Sophie. I'm not stupid." Her face paled. "You went through my things?" "I had to," I shot back. "Because you've been lying to me." Sophie's expression shifted, guilt giving way to anger. "You don't understand. It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is, Sophie," I said, my voice breaking. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with another man." She didn't answer immediately, her eyes filling with tears. "I made a mistake," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But it's not what you think. Please, just let me explain." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unconvincing. I wanted to believe her, to accept that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But the evidence, in my gut, told a different story. I turned away, the weight of her betrayal crashing over me like a tidal wave. "Go home, Sophie," I said, my voice hollow. "We'll talk later." As I walked away, I heard her call after me, but I didn't look back. The truth was out now, and there was no going back to how things were before. Whatever explanation Sophie had, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. The drive home from the bar felt endless. My grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles turned white. Sophie's words echoed in my mind. I made a mistake. That single phrase carried enough weight to flatten everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Yet, the way she'd said it was maddeningly vague, like she was trying to downplay a bomb she'd already detonated. By the time I got home, my thoughts had crystallized into a single goal. I needed answers, not excuses or half-truths. Sophie would tell me everything tonight, or I'd find out myself. She arrived home an hour later. I was waiting for her in the kitchen, my arms crossed. She paused in the doorway, her face etched with a mix of guilt and apprehension. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I know," she replied, setting her purse down carefully as if the slightest sudden movement might shatter the moment. "But you need to let me explain." "Go ahead," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "Start with Colin." Sophie hesitated, running her fingers through her hair. "He's an old boyfriend," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We dated years ago, before I met you. He reached out a few weeks ago, and I agreed to meet him." "Why?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes darted to the table, avoiding mine. "I don't know," she said. "I guess I was curious. Things haven't been great between us lately, and when he reached out, I just wanted to see what it felt like to talk to him again. But I swear, Mark, it wasn't about rekindling anything." I let out a bitter laugh. "It wasn't about rekindling anything? Then explain the hotel. The champagne." "That wasn't what it looked like," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. I didn't stay there with him. I booked the room for myself after we had dinner. I needed space to think." "To think," I repeated, my disbelief thick in the air. "And Colin just happened to be in the same town, at the same bar tonight?" Sophie flinched, her cheeks flushing. "It was a mistake," she said again. "A stupid, impulsive mistake. But nothing happened, Mark. I didn't cheat on you. I studied her face, searching for cracks in her story. She looked sincere, her eyes wide and glassy, her voice trembling. For a moment, I almost believed her. But something about her explanation felt off. Why hadn't she told me about Colin sooner? Why had she hidden the hotel receipt? I want to believe you, I said slowly. But you've been lying to me, Sophie. If it wasn't serious, why didn't you just tell me? Because I was ashamed, she said, tears spilling over now. I didn't know how to explain it without making you hate me. I just needed to see him to remind myself why I moved on, why I married you. And I do know, Mark, you're the one I want, not him. Her words softened something in me, despite my better judgment. Was it possible she was telling the truth? That this whole thing was just an emotional misstep, not a full-blown betrayal? I wasn't sure. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of hope that maybe we could fix this. The next few days passed uneventfully, though the tension between us lingered like smoke after a fire. Sophie seemed to be trying harder, texting me throughout the day, asking about my plans, even cooking dinner for the first time in months. It felt like she was trying to rebuild my trust, and I wanted to let her. But the doubts never fully went away. On Thursday, I decided to investigate further. Sophie had said she met Colin for closure, but something still didn't add up. If there was nothing serious between them, why was she acting so cagey? And why had she stayed overnight in a hotel? I logged into our shared phone plan account and pulled up her call records. My heart sank when I saw his number, Colin Ward, appear repeatedly over the past 2 weeks. Late-night calls, most lasting 30 minutes or more. I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest. If she'd ended things with Colin, why was she still talking to him? My hand hovered over my phone, torn between calling Sophie at work or calling Colin directly. But before I could decide, I noticed something else. A second unfamiliar number, one she'd called just as frequently. That evening, I waited until Sophie was asleep before sneaking into the living room with her phone. My hands shook as I unlocked it, the faint glow of the screen lighting up the dark room. She'd never changed her passcode, a detail that made me feel both relieved and guilty. I searched her contacts for the second number. It wasn't listed under a name, just the digits themselves. My pulse quickened as I opened her recent messages, scrolling until I found the matching thread. The conversation was brief but damning. Sophie, are we still on for Friday? I need to see you. Unknown, of course. Same place as last time? Sophie, yes. I can't wait. The date of the message was 2 days ago, long after her supposed closure with Colin. My stomach churned as I read the words again. She was planning another meeting, with someone else. The next day, I told Sophie I'd be working late, though I had no intention of staying at the office. I parked a block from the address where her messages had indicated she'd meet this mystery contact. It was a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I waited for an hour, my nerves fraying with each passing minute. Just when I started to think she might not show, I saw her walk in, her coat pulled tightly around her. She wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize followed her inside, placing a hand on her lower back as they entered. They sat in a corner booth, their heads close together. I snapped a photo from my car, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever this man was, he wasn't Colin. The twist of betrayal felt sharper now, layered with confusion. If Sophie's story about Colin was true, then who was this? And why had she lied again? I waited until they left, following at a safe distance as they walked to a nearby hotel. When they disappeared inside, I knew the truth, as much as it gutted me to admit it. Sophie wasn't just hiding something. She was hiding everything. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. My mind raced with questions, but one stood out above the rest. How long had this been going on? Sophie's betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined, and whatever explanation she'd given me before was just another layer of deception. When she returned home that night, her face was calm, even cheerful. "Hey," she said, hanging her coat by the door. "How was your day?" I stared at her, my chest tight with the weight of what I knew. "Fine," I said, my voice cold. "How was yours?" She hesitated, her smile faltering. Busy, she said carefully. Why? No reason, I replied, my jaw clenched. Just curious. I turned away before she could see the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. The resolution I'd thought I'd found was gone, replaced by a burning need to confront her. But not yet. Not until I had the full picture. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after my surveillance at the cafe, I woke with a heavy heart and a head full of questions. Sophie was already up, humming in the kitchen like it was any other day. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what I'd seen the night before. Her cheerful facade was unbearable now. Every smile, every kind word, it all felt like a lie. But the biggest question still loomed. Who was the man at the cafe, and why had she lied about Colin if there was someone else in the picture? By the time I joined her in the kitchen, I'd made a decision. I couldn't dance around this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Sophie, I said as I sat down, my tone heavy, we need to talk. She turned to face me, her expression immediately guarded. Okay, she said slowly, setting down her mug. What's on your mind? I know about the cafe, I said, watching her closely. Her eyes widened just slightly before she masked her reaction. I saw you last night. With him. Her face drained of color, and she took a step back, leaning against the counter as if to steady herself. Mark, she began, her voice shaking. I can explain. Go ahead, I said, my voice sharp. Explain. Because as far as I can tell, you've been lying to me about everything. She hesitated, her lips trembling as she tried to find the words. It's not what you think, she said finally. The man you saw, he's not what you think he is. Then who is he? I demanded. Another old boyfriend? A business contact? Someone else you needed closure with? No, she said, her voice breaking. He's my brother. The words hit me like a slap, stopping me mid-breath. Your brother? I repeated, disbelief dripping from my tone. Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. His name is Eric. I haven't told you about him because, she trailed off, struggling to continue. Because he's not supposed to exist. What the hell does that mean? I asked, my anger mingling with confusion. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. My parents had a child before me. A boy. But they gave him up for adoption when they were young, before they got married. I only found out about him recently. My mom mentioned him in her will after she passed. I stared at her, trying to process this revelation. So, you've been meeting with him in secret? I didn't know how to tell you, she said, her tears spilling over now. I didn't even know how to handle it myself. He reached out to me after he found our mom's will. He wanted to meet and I couldn't say no. I didn't want to drag you into something I barely understood. Her explanation sent my thoughts spinning. It made sense on the surface, but it didn't explain everything. Not the hotel receipt, not the champagne, not Colin. What about Colin? I asked. Where does he fit into this? Sophie froze, her expression tightening. Colin has nothing to do with Eric, she said carefully. That was separate. Her words were like gasoline on a fire. Separate? I said, my voice rising. You're seriously telling me you've been sneaking around with your long-lost brother and an ex-boyfriend at the same time? What kind of twisted explanation is that? It wasn't like that, she said quickly. Mark, please, just listen to me. No, I snapped. I've been listening. I've been listening to lies and half-truths and whatever this is supposed to be. Just tell me the damn truth, Sophie. She broke then, collapsing into the chair across from me, her face buried in her hands. I didn't sleep with Colin, she said, her voice muffled. I swear. But I did meet him. And I did it because I was scared. Scared of what? I asked, my voice hard. Of us, she said, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Of where we were headed. Mark, I love you. But things haven't been the same between us for a long time. I felt like I was losing you. And when Colin reached out, it felt like a chance to remind myself of who I was before all of this. Her confession felt like a punch to the gut. So what? I said. You thought revisiting your past would fix our marriage? By lying to me? By sneaking around? I didn't think, she admitted. I was selfish. I just wanted to feel something. Something different. But I swear, Mark, nothing physical happened. It was just dinner. Just talking. I wanted to believe her. But the layers of deception made it almost impossible. And the hotel? I asked. And the champagne? She hesitated again, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. The hotel was for me, she said. I needed time to clear my head. The champagne. Colin sent it to the room. I didn't ask for it. The explanation felt thin, but there was a rawness in her voice that made me pause. Sophie wasn't good at lying under pressure, and if this was a lie, it was an elaborate one. Still, the damage was done. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild with tears and confessions. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her words pressing down on us. Finally, I spoke. I don't know if I can get past this, I said, my voice low. Even if nothing physical happened, you still lied. You still hid things from me. How am I supposed to trust you again? I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this, Mark, but I want to try. Please. Her plea hung in the air, a desperate attempt to pull us back from the edge. But I didn't know if there was anything left to save. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell her where I was going, and she didn't ask. I needed space, time to think about everything I'd learned. Sophie's betrayal wasn't the clear-cut affair I'd feared, but it was betrayal nonetheless. She'd crossed lines that couldn't be erased. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, the same one where I'd stayed the night after discovering the hotel receipt. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet, I felt the full weight of the decision before me. Forgiveness felt impossible, but so did letting go of the life we'd built together. Sophie's actions had shattered my trust, but her tears, her guilt, they weren't the marks of someone who didn't care. They were the marks of someone who'd made a terrible mistake. The question was whether I could live with that mistake, or whether it was time to start over. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized there was no easy answer. Love wasn't simple, and neither was betrayal. The truth was messy, complicated, and painful, and no matter what I decided, it would leave scars. When I finally drifted off to sleep, Sophie's voice echoed in my mind. I didn't know how to tell you. Maybe she hadn't, but the damage was done, and now, the choice was mine to make.